Lindsey Lickers, thank you so much for joining me today. It is a pleasure being with you. Uh, is it medicine water or water medicine woman and medicine water?
So it's meshkeke nebe, so medicine water.
Medicine water. Lindsey, thank you so much for joining me today. Part of these gatherings with newcomer artists and people who have an interest to learn more about indigenous knowledge, indigenous stories, and history, and the history as well. I had the pleasure of working with you for a couple of years already, and I have learned so much from you every time that we have an engagement, that we have a conversation. There's something new, and thank you so much for always bringing us back and bringing me back and to ground myself and to remember things that sometimes when we are working on so many processes, we can forget about because, I am from Santiago de Cali, Valle del Cauca, Colombia. So, of course, a lot of mestizaje, a lot of mixes as well, and a lot of colonization happening in South America as well. And I think that sometimes it's about remembering and bringing those memory bags that are way back in our heads. So I would like to offer you this tobacco uh, for your time, for the time that you're sharing with us today. Thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to learn from you, to get inspired by you, and all the knowledge that you carry through all this year of the work that you do in Ontario, in Canada, and the engagements that you do. For those who don't know, and probably at the beginning of the presentation, you will see Lindsey's bio. But Lindsey is an artist, she's a facilitator, she's an Indigenous educator as well. So Lindsey, welcome, and has I mentioned before, a part of the curation of the program was about the earth and Tero, this word in Esperanto that has the hopes of bringing us all together to speak the same language and to at least understand each other from that perspective. So this tobacco, thank you. I hope to get to you in person. Otherwise, I can mail it to you. Or as I mentioned to Veronica Journey, she shared with us, just put it by a tree, open a hole, and just put the tobacco in it as well. So I hope you accept this offer from my end. And Lindsey, so this conversation, the Wampum Belts and these treaties, uh, if you can just walk us through, of course, your presentation, but also the importance and the things that we need to remember, especially when you are new to this land, to Turtle Island, to Canada, to Takaronto, things that we should remember. And this conversation is for non-Indigenous, a newcomer artist, or that's the main focus, but of course, anybody else is welcome to listen to this conversation. So for all of you who are joining in from the comfort of your homes, uh, thank you for joining us. And Lindsey, I will let you to continue. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that intro. And thank you so much for presenting tobacco first. Um, it really is, one of those ways that we can begin to have, really good conversations, but also opening our spaces and our minds and our hearts and our spirits in a really good way. So I definitely appreciate that. So miigwech now for that. For myself, I would love if you could go put that by the water. And I'll get to talking about
We'll do
why
that
in
for
a little
sure.
bit.
We'll do that for sure.
Awesome. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen. I'm going to shut my camera off just because I am in a remote location. So I have some internet trouble sometimes when I do both of them. And also, please pardon my just getting over some illness. So I may need to kind of go slower than I normally do. I do tend to try to fit as many things in as possible in the time. But just to allow, for my voice, and I may need to excuse myself a little bit here and there to cough. So I don't want to cough in everybody's ears. So let me go ahead. So I'll do that now. Go. And stop my video. And can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so first and foremost, Ani, Bojo, Mashkikene Bikoyan Dishnakaz, Meziki and Odem, Six Nations, Mississauga Kinjunjiba. So what I said there was my traditional name, or what creation calls me, what creation knows me by, is Mashkikenebe, which translates to medicine water. And I also gave you some information about where I'm from, which I'll get into actually because it's a part of the presentation. But firstly, I just wanted to kind of open up the space in recognition of what I've been invited to come and talk to everybody about. So essentially, what Julian had asked me to come and talk about was around this idea around treaty and land. That's the theme of this iteration. So really trying to get a sense of what does that mean. And for me, when I think about land and I think about treaty, I think about also, in addition to that, the connection that it has to us as humans, as spiritual beings having a human experience in a body. And a big part of this, when we start to explore this notion, is this idea of connection. And I have here in brackets the importance of reconnection, because I believe, at least in what I've seen in the teachings that I carry, is regardless of things that have happened over time, we're always connected. Even when we feel like we're not connected to the land, to the earth, to the water, to the animals, to everything in creation, to all of our relations, we're always connected. So really, it's a matter of that reconnection, that remembering, right, of who we are and how we are to walk on the earth. So as I started in the beginning, I introduced myself. That's essentially pretty standard that you'll hear across anytime we gather in circle, anytime we gather to share information. One of the first pieces of protocol that exists within Indigenous communities is, really letting people know where you come from, who are you, where do you come from, what is the land base that you are connected to. And especially, if you're fortunate to have a name as well and have know that information and have obtained that part of your journey, it also helps to let us know, what creation, not only what creation calls you, but what kind of gifts you bring, what type of responsibilities you bring with you. So every single one of us is unique and has a very unique connection within our bloodlines, and especially nation to nation, we're all going to have different gifts. And that is in particular by design. That's the beauty of creation and being made in the likeness of creator. So I really wanted to take the time to set that groundwork of, really rooting this conversation in a way in which I understand, how did I come to this place of understanding my connection to the earth and to land. And really, it starts with all of those pieces. So, as I mentioned earlier, Mashkike Nebe, right? That's my name that was given to me. And I think it's important to recognize that I identify as both Ongwahonwe and also Anishinaabe, which is members of, nations from the Six Nations of the Grand River, but also Ojibwe from the Mississaugas of Credit First Nation, the traditional name of Mississaugis, which literally translates to many river mouths. And on my Ongwahonwe side, it's the Genegeha that I'm actually the nation part of that nation, which is the Mohawk Nation, which translates to and is understood as the keepers of the Eastern Door. And if you break down the name that I have is an Ojibwe name. And if you break that one down even further, Bashkike, literally translating to medicine, but bigger than that, actually recognizing that connection and the strength of the earth. And then Nebe, literally translating to water. And it's interesting because if you think about it, if you look down further, I'm Turtle Clan, and that clan, denotes a lot of different pieces about my personality, about my responsibilities within my nation, a bit about my lineage and my family and where I come from and what I'm connected to. So it's interesting as I'm starting to take and dissect these things, they give us a lot of information around not even just how you show up in the world, but also how you relate to the land. How do you relate to community? How does community see you? What can you contribute to the circle? And Turtle Clan, when you look at a lot of the different teachings, different nations have different teachings, but this is what I've come to understand about my clan as it relates to myself, in some of the qualities that I've been able to pick up within my journey and my earth walk thus far. And what's been really interesting is to see the correlation between not only my clan but also my name. So being of two worlds, right, of being able to be adaptable within spaces. So you can see here I've broken down some of the traits of Turtle Clan to give you an understanding of just how deep these, um, you know, may seem like a characteristic, or it might seem like a descriptor, but it's so much more than that. And that's really indicative of Indigenous cultures and nations generally. So some of the things that, I suppose as a Turtle Clan I'm quite good at is, um, what it can translate to in terms of these teachings within the nations is, the literal shifting of the earth, and the recognition and the utilization of the cycles of the moon. So having that information and being a timekeeper in that sense of rhythmic cycle, right? Natural law and rhythmic cycle. Because a lot of our indigenous nations really did follow, the moon cycles, which is and resides within, a stream of matriarchal knowledge. But that was how we were able to, we had ceremonies that went with the cycles of the moon. There was certain moon cycles, that would donate or, would be in relevance to, say, for example, planting seeds. That was the time to plant seeds. And then there's other moons that come that are like the harvest moon, that is time for harvest, literally. Um, Different parts in the winter time will be for exchanging teachings and medicines and talking about and sharing information. So it's basically, as the Turtle Clan, kind of basically understanding and helping people remember that we're to be doing these things at what times, but also to be sensitive and open and receptive to that energy that comes every month. Um, and then, of course, with that layered is also a connection to, the womb and the women, right, and the water carriers and the seed carriers, and how that plays into a lot of different other teachings within all of the nations as well. So another part of here is, quite literally the keepers of the land. But as far as traits, which is funny to me because when I look at them, it makes a lot of sense with the earth walk I've had so far. So, being a very methodical thinker, I tend to, um, just so that you get to know where I'm coming from here. Yes, I'm an artist, but I'm also really involved in advocacy, as well as, contributing to policy recommendations and, really kind of helping support community in, gathering information and making sense of that information. So one of the things, like, it's a favorite pastime of mine, is creating reports. That's kind of nerdy, but I just love it. I don't know. I've always loved doing things like that, which makes sense in correlation to my Turtle Clan, sensibilities. Cautious, longevity, resiliency, the adaptability, and also the protective pieces. So if you think about the turtle itself, the turtle has a really amazing ability to be constantly at home. They're always at home no matter where they go because they carry their home on their back, right? It's their shell. So, and they're also one of the most, highly protected, animals, because they can go inside and immediately they're armored, and it's very difficult for other animals to actually, puncture that shell. So there is that, as well as that layered context of what that brings and what kind of traits are there. And the last piece too, not liking to be rushed. That's something I am learning. But but yes, just really arriving on your own time and allowing is something that I'm learning within my earth walk. Pardon me. But one of the things that the reason why I have these pictures here is, I have a image of, again, it's just that recognition of the lineage of, where I've come from and how I understand land is really understanding, my connection to my ancestors and understanding where I've come from in terms of my lineages and the matriarchy in particular. So I have a little picture here that's little me. I was really sassy. And I feel like I still embody quite a bit of the personality. And then, me moving into starting to do this work and, really starting to understand those connections to land and ceremony and pieces like that. And then also I have my grandmother that's on my matriarchal side. And I love that she's standing in water. So there's a lot of water and earth connection here. And then also that painting that's there is the painting of my first time going out fasting. So that was a time that I was able to go and fast next to a creek. So I was able to, really strengthen and begin, deepening my understanding of what that actually means and what connection is. So as we're talking about land, one of the things that I wanted to share was some images. These are recent images I actually took, and it's literally me on my homeland. Up until the pandemic, I actually was a resident of Toronto for 15 plus years and recently moved back to my territory in Six Nations of the Grand River. So this is some of the things, and these are just, moments that I've gone out and done my own, put out offerings, just sat with the land, really went out and had that time, with myself. But I think it's important, again, I'm really just saying all of this and sharing this is to really root this conversation of, the significance of, where I come from, where I'm kind of situated within this conversation, and why it's so important to me. So I've been asked to, again, talk about this idea of wampum belts in particular. So this is the Hiawatha Belt, otherwise known as the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Belt. And I'll go into a little bit of what that is, but I just want to show you just so that you have an understanding of what it is that we're talking about. But essentially, these belts and these wampum belts and these treaties, I think it's important to understand that the reason why they were made were very much for peacekeeping and for understanding, how we are to be stronger nations through peace, through power, through righteousness, through these major themes, which are very complex, themes that we don't necessarily have the time to go into. But I did want to have this kind of over high level conversation just so you can kind of start thinking about what these pieces really are. And I think when I was sitting with this information, with this request around to talk about this, I always go with what I'm guided to say and what I'm guided to share. And I'm speaking to you from a time when, yesterday was Red Dress Day. So this is the remembrance and, increasing awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And especially, and as well as Two-Spirit individuals who are affected by that issue. Now, why is that relevant to what we're talking about in terms of treaty? I will dive into a bit because I think it's really important to understand, the foundations of, why these things were created, and why they're so important now, right? If not even more so as it relates to strengthening the relationship between Indigenous nations and non-Indigenous peoples. Because there's the direct correlation between all of those things that I'm going to illustrate for you. Pardon me. So again, yes, these are important, right? I'm not denoting the importance of these things. However, I think that there's a bigger piece here to concentrate first, and that is this understanding that each of these nations, I'm going to be talking about the Haudenosaunee people, but also about the Anishinaabe people. And ultimately what happened we have to remember that what came before the treaties that were made with other nations, with other sovereign nations, was the original treaty, which was our creation story, which is our connection to creation. That's our original treaty that we all carry. And that was very much on purpose. I have some images here. This is some work that I did, Mizebik, a while back now, but this is utilizing the Haudenosaunee dome structure that basically allows us, it's an icon, it's a symbol that helps us remember what that relationship is between the earth and then sky world, which is where we say creation resides and where those original instructions came down from with Sky Woman. And I have an image that I love so much of Shelley Nero's work of Sky Woman, really talking about, and that's kind of one of our first stories of recognizing the connection between the earth as our mother, but that direct connection to the earth, to the water, to women, right? And the responsibility that came down to earth within these stories that is still very much a part of those original instructions, which whatever way, again, I've always been reiterating that nations have different ways that they understand how they came here. However, I would argue that every single nation has, women, the water carriers, the life givers, as the central focus of their communities, because without which none of us would exist. We have to think about, that really big importance and emphasize just how sacred that connection is. And that is going to give us clues as to how we've kind of got off track with how we treat the land, where we are in terms of history, and also I would argue like how we treat each other, right? Because it's no secret, and I'm not going to be giving a history lesson of colonialism, because I think a lot of us, if you're not from a Western culture, you most likely have been colonized. That's just the reality of the situation, right? That we're in. This is the time that we're in. This is the timeline we're in. And there's so much information out there around how that's been done. But from an Indigenous perspective, that's really why you see today the idea and, different things being said out in media or out in the communities is, water is life, honoring the matriarchies, right? Really challenging patriarchal values, as well as, really exercising the need to come back to sovereignty. And that's really the whole piece around and behind the campaign around land back, for example. There's a big piece in that. And I think sometimes people misunderstand what that actually means. From conversation, and I've been doing this for a long time, right? Having these conversations. And oftentimes a lot of people are misunderstanding that it's really, people sometimes think that it's about Indigenous people wanting to have control over the land, right? You see that a lot with settlements, right? People wanting to, have clearer settlements, and you see all these repatriation funds and things like that coming out of it. But that's not really what it is. That's a very band-aid approach to what actually is the deeper meaning between this. And what the deeper meaning of treaty and of connection to land and all those pieces that I just told you is this recognition that we are trying, and what our original instruction was to defend the land. It was to steward the land because of this connection to women, right? This connection to women is really a physical manifestation of a spiritual concept as an actualization of this teaching that we all have within different nations, is this connection to creation. Because women are the only ones that are able to birth, right? To bring in spirit and to ground it in the earth, and to birth it forward in an earth walk that becomes, you and me and, everybody on this that is watching this. without which, like I said earlier, we would not exist. So the earth, and if you think about that parallel to women, we're really made in this, it's a mirror, right? We're made in the mirror image of creation. So there's a connection there. I'm not going to go about this right now, but um, so I'm going to jump around a little bit, but pardon me. It's that's why we're really talking about this connection. I think this is really important, right? Like, we don't talk about it enough, these parallels, but essentially, one of the things that I hear a lot of is, well, how do we start to repair these relationships? Yes, honoring the treaties is important. Yes, all of these things, because those were all pieces that allowed us to remember our instructions of how we were to interact with each other. But if we don't have that strong connection to ourselves first, there's absolutely no way that we're going to be able to connect with one another within those original instructions, within those treaties. And how we create connection to each other is through ourselves. But ultimately, if you think about it in what I just mentioned about this mirror made in the mirror image, essentially, we are always going to be disconnected from ourselves so long as we are disconnected from the earth. And that's the key thing. I hope that that's really, really ringing for people here. That's the point I want to drive home, is if we want to start really remembering, if we want to really start reconciling with that history, that's the part we have to reconcile with, is the fact that there has something that has caused a fracture that has traveled through many centuries. I'm talking thousands of years. And I don't know where specifically it pinpoints to. It's a question I often wonder myself. I've spent many times out in the bush, on the land, in ceremony, asking these types of questions, like, what happened? And for those of you that don't know, like, yes, I'm an artist, but I'm also involved in social services, like I said, about advocacy. So I have a lot of training in trauma-informed practices. I also have been heavily part of the anti-trafficking movement. So I'm very, very versed and actually trained in raising awareness and helping survivors, exit situations involved in exploitation. And that's been a big part of my life's work that coincides with me as an artist and as an educator. And so what I've come to understand through not only being in the front line, supporting survivors, and having actually really too, I want to take the time to honor the fact that I've even been able to be in these spaces, to be able to support women and girls and two-spirit individuals, trans individuals, to be able to move through these spaces. The fact that I've even been entrusted to be a support person for these types of things is really, it's not lost on me how sacred that is. So that's something that I'm very, very fiercely protective of, is this this work, and that it's done in the best way possible. But this is where I think that it's the time that we need to start having these connections and drawing these connections out and bringing them up to the surface. And that's part of the truth telling that needs to happen when we're in these spaces. So I really hope that that's sticking out to you and understanding that there is a connection here. And one of the things that, we need to, or we can do to be more responsible when we're having these conversations, is just even to acknowledge that, this is something that is connected, but starting to ask questions around how we got here, right? Why is it that we are still in this space? Why, and then also too, I would argue, why is it getting worse, right? Why at a time too when there's a simultaneous rising of truth, literally, because we have our children coming home, being recovered, right, from graves from the residential school system, but we also simultaneously have our women being taken from our communities, right, and stolen. Really, that's what people are talking about when we're saying stolen sisters. And there's a very specific reason for that is connected to land and resources. So I did this up because it didn't exist. So, me, creative, I, made that happen. And whoops, sorry, go back here for a second, just a second, okay? Hi, sorry, my dog was getting into something. I had to grab him real quick. Yeah, so I made this up because it didn't exist, and I just wanted something to illustrate what it is that we're talking about, why this disconnection has gone on for so long, and how we can start to repair it. Not just for Indigenous nations, but also for non-Indigenous people to understand why this is so important, right? And and how this can actually connect to other nations of people and other histories, right? So the way that many of our communities were set up pre-contact was this through a circular method, and it was implemented and strengthened by roles, rights, responsibilities that everybody had in contributing to the circle and in contributing to the community. So if you think about this pre-contact, a community would have in its middle, at its core, right? That's like the core of the spirit of the community, would be the bundle, which is our traditional, bundle, which would inside of it would include our teachings, our original instructions, those creation stories, right? Ceremonies that have come up in that time to help us remember connection, to strengthen connection. Our medicines, our sacred medicines that were given to us to help us communicate with spirit, to help us strengthen that connection with the land, the water, each other, everything in creation. Also in that bundle would be, our ethics, our morals, our codes. In that bundle would also be our treaties, our wampum belts, our birch scrolls, all the things that, really it was that space where our identity was intact, right? All the tools that we use to remember. And right next to that bundle, what we would place next to that bundle would be the children, right? Those little ones that just came from creation in the Eastern Door. So they would be close with our bundles. And that was for a very specific purpose, because there's a belief that many nations have, because of children coming from that place, they have a stronger sense of that remembering, so they could even contribute things to the bundle that we may not even have been able to fathom. But also we want to make sure that as they grew and they became women and men and elders, protectors, they started to fulfill their roles, that they would always remember what those tools were, but they would never forget, so that they would never be able to forget their identity and their core of who they are. Accurate. Around the bundle of the children would be the women and the elders. The elders, again, because of their experience being connected to the bundle, most times they're very much connected to conducting ceremony and being the keepers of those medicines, the harvesters, all of those things. And then the women, because the women would be taking care of, think about this way back pre-contact, women would be the ones that are taking care of the settlement, wherever the community was, and taking care of the children, and so on and so forth. Outside of this, as the next ring of protection, would be the men, right? They would be doing what they need to do, hunting, out doing what they're doing, surveying the land, making sure things were good there, really being on alert. And really what the role was is the protection, not only of the women and the elders, the bundle and the children, but also the protectors of the land. Everybody is the protector of the land, but that specifically, because of the nature of how they revolved around the community, that was really highlighted in that role. And then outside of that, you have your nation and your treaty, and that outside ring, I have it just there to remember that when we go out of our community, that's really what governs how we relate to other nations and how we relate to other treaties, and that's where they converge. And the reason why I'm saying this is I want people to understand how colonialism has been so successful, is because we need to think about what was targeted and why. So one of the first things that happened when settlers came to our communities, and another piece that it's really important to recognize, and this isn't every nation, but it's most nations, that most nations were matriarchal based, because of that honoring of that connection to creation being made in creation's likeness, being able to be a water carrier, a seed carrier, a life giver. There was an innate sense of leadership involved in that. So oftentimes in many of our nations, our women were the leaders, and they kind of governed the bigger decision making, and what was the best for the entirety of the community. And that has a lot to do with even feminine and masculine polarity. So, but when settlers first came to our communities, seeing this structure, it was very confusing. So one of the first things that happened, because they're coming from a place that's very different from ours of how they do business, right? How they interact with their own communities and their own people. When a settler would come in and say, take me to, I want to talk to your leadership, right? Or however they would get that message across. When they were taken to the women, it was confusing. So they automatically turned their backs to the women, and then shook hands with the men. So already there, we have an initial fracture of that role, those roles, those rights, those responsibilities. And as throughout history, again, I'm not giving a history lesson, but as history has moved on, then we see the very strategic removal and effect of culture. So the bundle, children, residential schools, right? Children being taken from that. And if you think about that, you take the children, you take the bundle, what's left in the middle at the core for the women and the elders to, converge around? Where's the purpose, right? Where's the anchor? The anchor's no more. So there's a lot of disarray that's happening in the community. Simultaneously, the men are being, brought into other things, other dealings are starting to be introduced to alcohol, or starting to introduce to other things. So they're eradicating and minimizing this role as protectors. So again, it's an effect of purpose, right? And if you take away those things and you start having, those implications on each of these rings, eventually you basically snap that strength of the whole nation and the treaty itself. So that is something that's gone on, and it's still going on. We're still repairing that. On the positive side, we are repairing that, and it's actually stronger than I think I've ever seen it in my life. And we have that to thank to a lot of our ancestors and the people that came before us that never forgot, that held on to that bundle so tightly that now we still have those things to be able to go back to, and those tools to help us remember. So, pardon me. Why is this not moving? Oh, there we go. Okay, so all that's to say, we get back to the treaties. So the treaties, like I said in the beginning, were really meant for piecing. They were peace offerings. They were pieces to remember how we are to deal with unrest, right, in our communities. Now, the Hiawatha Belt, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy Belt, specifically came from a time when at the time, 5 nations later became the 6 nations with the addition of the Tuscarora nation. But this original belt was made because our nations were warring with one another. We forgot our original instruction, right? We have in the Haudenosaunee people, we have different instructions that came before. Like if you're interested, you can go and take a look at the Code of Handsome Lake is one of them. And then you have, again, like I mentioned, our original instructions that are embedded in our creation stories, in our cycle of ceremonies, all of those things. But this in particular was made at a time when we were forgetting all of those things, right? We were getting off track of what we were originally supposed to be doing in terms of our relationship to each other. And again, of course, because that is always directly related to our relationship to the land and our relationship to ourselves. So we were getting off track. And so this is actually the commemoration of the time that the peacemaker, And you can look into that if you'd like to. It's a really beautiful story. And when it's traditionally recited, it can take up to 2 weeks. So it's a very in-depth thing. And there's so many different layers to it. And I would also argue that some of these things really do stay within our communities for very good purpose, as I just mentioned to you, in terms of the breakdown of culture and our roles and rights and responsibilities as people. So many nations are very protective of their knowledge, and with very good reason. So, but generally, just for understanding, if you've never seen this before, that's what this is it's the representation of that time in history when we made that agreement, and it's basically making the agreement to never forget again, right? So within that, it shows, and then within this, it also shows roll call of the responsibilities of each nation within the Confederacy that makes up the Longhouse, as another way that people would say it. So within that, you have the Seneca, which is the keepers of the Western Door. And I'm very proud to say that that is my father's matriarchy side. So I actually am connected to the Seneca through my grandmother, who I share a home with now in Six Nations. So that's that side. And then we have the Cayuga there and the Onondaga in the middle. The Onondaga in the middle are there, and that image there is kind of in a shape of I guess some people kind of look at it as like the flint, but it's not necessarily that. It actually is a translation of the Great Tree of Peace, in which our weaponry were buried under. And that tree is actually said to be in existence in Onondaga Nation in lower US, or in upper US, lower end of the Confederacy area, because the Confederacy also we didn't have boundaries, like we didn't have borders. The borders, at least we see today, we didn't have. So then we also go through here to the Oneida, and then also the Mohawk, which are the keepers of the Eastern Door, which I am a part of as well. The Onondaga as well are part of my grandfather's side. So it's really interesting. The more I dig into my family history, the more I see that I have a lot of Haudenosaunee lineage. And then also, of course, like I said, Anishinaabe, which we'll talk about. So for the Anishinaabe, the Three Fires Confederacy is very specific to this area in Ontario, and then also parts of the US, because again, really emphasizing we didn't have the same borders, right? We didn't have borders in that way. We had territory, which is a bit different. But essentially, the Three Fires Confederacy is similar to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy in that it was created as an alliance to move different interests ahead. And a lot of it was connected to wars that we were engaging in with the English, the French, the Dutch that were coming over and trying to take up territory. So a lot of our history with Indigenous nations is actually a lot of being pitted against one another, which is something that even today we're still trying to, kind of get our footing on and really remember again those original instructions. But the Three Fires Confederacy is made up of the Ojibwe, which is seen as the first not that there's a hierarchy, it's more just that they were the first ones to kind of forge the Confederacy. And then we also have the Odawa and the Potawatomi. And the Potawatomi is kind of seen as the little brother because of, again, the last to join, I guess, in that Confederacy. And their iconography is really based in Thunderbird, which is linked to Thunderbird teachings, which is also part of creation stories, which we don't have enough time to go into. It's a lot of, and there's so many different stories of the Thunderbird. But again, similarly to the Haudenosaunee, I put in here a bit of some symbolism that shows and illustrates the Anishinaabe roll call of natural law. So you can see at the top here, we have Gitchimanadu, which is the big spirit, which is, creation, where creation lies. Then you have these dome structures that kind of talk about these in-between places that have bigger spirits that are, they function to support people, right? To support the Anishinaabe, the people, but also to support the animals and everything that resides on the earth, and also in between the earth and then creation, where creation lies. And then there's 4 beings that are attached to that, which you can see there by the circle that kind of shows where they govern. And then we go down here and we see the animals, and the animals always come before people because they were here first. And then we have the people, and then our, the actual nations on land, and then our relationship to land and below. That's a very like breezing through description, but I just wanted to give that to you so you can kind of see what that looks like. And then this piece here is my most recent piece that was done, called Consoled by Creation, and it's basically talking about those different layers, but generally talking about that connection and being connected to something bigger than us, as specifically as life givers. And then this is also a combination not only of my understanding of my Anishinaabe lineage, but also my Nishoni lineage. So getting back to what we were talking about in terms of the women, I really just wanted to drive that back, as far as treaty, yes, it's important. Yes, it's great to try to know a bit more. But I would argue that the one treaty that we need to understand the most in these types of relationships that, I'm coming to share with you is the Gaswenta, or otherwise known as the Two-Row Wampum. This is a wampum that was signed or that was created between the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee people, and the primarily Dutch, but now it's become bigger in that it's pretty much it's basically like a representation of Indigenous peoples now, and newcomers, settlers, non-Indigenous people generally sharing space, right? So it denotes, you can see these 2 lines here, but essentially one is supposed to be, and again, this is really high level explanation, right? All of these wampum belts, all of these teachings are so involved that they could take days to talk about. But the general concept is 1 line denotes the ship, 1 line denotes the canoe, and we have the river that's flowing. And each of those individual lines of wampum talk about roles, rights, responsibilities within that relationship, and they break down. Some people kind of look at it as a high level is remembering that peace, power, and righteousness that I talked about, that is at the foundation of the Great Law. But again, instructions around how we're to relate to each other, how we're to relate to ourselves, how we're to relate to the land. But essentially, this piece is really talking about, allowing, not even allowing, but just recognizing that Indigenous nations, Indigenous peoples have all of those pieces around their original instructions of what they're here to do and how they're here to act within that relationship. And then also recognizing that we're now sharing space with those that were never here originally, right? So that's any non-Indigenous person or people representing that other space, the boat, right? But it's that recognition that we're not to interfere with what we're not going to go, people from the canoe are not going to go on the ship and drive the ship, and people from the ship are not going to come in the canoe and drive the canoe. It's a recognition of sovereignty, ultimately what it comes down to. And then also going in the same direction, having similar goals, but also I think at the very core is never forging and never remembering those instructions. Because the other piece that we have to remember within all of this is, even if you look at the Royal Proclamation, things that came that were kind of the foundational documents of Canada always talk about relationships and agreements, legal agreements that were forged between sovereign nations, between Indigenous sovereign nations and everybody else. So those agreements are based on understandings, they're contracts, they're legally binding contracts. And that's what we're finding our time in now is, how do we honor that? And essentially we're trying to come back from a place that, for many hundreds and hundreds of years of having our treaties broken. One treaty actually talks about that it would be broken if, anybody was to dig past the length of a plow. that's, that's happened. That happens every day. There's some settlements that are going on around where I am on the territory I'm on. Developments, big corporations coming in and buying up land and digging and uprooting it. And, that's going on constantly. So we're constantly having to try to remind people about this and really have that community forward action to hold the accountability, right? Because you have to remember, again, it's not about the power. It's not about governing. It's not about residing, controlling over the land. Stewardship is about protecting the land. Because if we do not have the land, then we do not survive, right? It's integral to our survival. If we allow the constant abuse of the land, of the water, of the animals, of all of these things, if we allow it to continue, eventually there will be nothing to protect and we will have no air to breathe. We will have no water to drink. And, we essentially will be forging the path and reinforcing the path to our non-existence, right? Our extinction. So that's another piece that people don't take seriously enough. But again, the reason why this has gone on so long and it's still allowed to go on is that there's a direct connection between the way that we honor matriarchy, the way that we honor women and we protect or not, and why things are allowed to be taken from the earth continually. There's no nourishment. The nourishment that is embedded in these teachings is absent. So that's why you see so many community members and people trying to revive water ceremonies, trying to revive those pieces, right? And why we're even sitting in this conversation, having this talk, is because we're trying to get back to that place of that remembrance, because we're running out of time. We're really running out of time. It's getting worse and worse. And as long as we see that devaluing and that unrecognition of that relationship to women within all of our communities, not just Indigenous communities, everybody. So long as patriarchy is, ruling and making decisions and kind of exerting that askewed view of power, that we won't ever get to that place to be able to strengthen that relationship and really come back to that remembrance place, and that really truly powerful place, because the land provides everything for us. And it's not a pie. It's not like if I, especially if you think about capitalism, it's not about, if I give up a little piece of what I have, I'm not going to have enough and you're going to take everything. It's not about that, because the land is constantly providing within that reciprocal relationship. When it's reciprocal, when it's being nourished, right? When the mother is being respected, she's constantly giving. And that, again, is the likeness of creation. Creation is constantly giving to us. And all we need to do is remember, and what we should be doing is remembering to return the favor. So, me, Goetch, I don't know if I covered everything, but that's kind of where I'm feeling that we need to end. So, Miigwech, now.
Lindsey, thank you so much. As I mentioned before, I'm always learning something, and your beautiful piece, the latest one, and it's so, it works my heart, because then I start identifying items like the strawberry that was part of the painting that I recently made, and for you folks who might don't know, there is a teachings of the strawberries as well, and there's so many teachings. As Lindsey mentioned, this is just like a very tiny summary of so many things, but unfortunately, today I was having a conversation, and sometimes even, unfortunately, the reference library and the libraries are so full of other knowledge that if we were able to collect all the knowledge, that we have to recognize that sometimes, as one of your friends, I think it was James Carpenter, mentioned, like, It's a knowledge that is passed through like oral to the others. It's not on a paper, it's not written down. And it's that knowledge that sometimes has been forgotten, even in the Toronto library system, that I have to acknowledge that they have now an office, an Indigenous Affairs office at the City of Toronto and also at the reference library, but so much beautiful knowledge and the stories of creations and the stories of Indigenous peoples, and of course the history of colonization and repression that you and your communities have to go through. I just want to thank you, Lindsey, for taking the time. I know you are not feeling very well today, but thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I was like holding this tobacco. Lindsey, every time that I have a tobacco in my hand, I think about Lindsey. Even if I'm not engaging with Lindsey, because she has a very beautiful story about tobacco, um, and 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 how it connects us with the creation, and it talks to us, and Lindsey can testify about it. But Lindsey, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for going through this presentation and sharing with you all this beautiful information, your knowledge, and language. Thank you so much. Gracias.
Oh, no problem. It was lovely. Important conversations. So I'm always grateful to be a part of it and that I'm invited back to keep having them.
Lindsey, one more question. Thinking about newcomers, and I was asking Veronica Johnny the same questions. When I moved to Canada, and as I mentioned before, I started my journey understanding and getting to know Indigenous peoples in 2016, 2015, and I was so afraid of uh, talking to Indigenous peoples, even though I come from different nations, but it's still Indigenous, and they have always mentioned, Lindsey and some other Indigenous peoples, that everybody's Indigenous in their own nations as well, in their own territory. It's just understanding where we are. If some people want more information, if they want to approach Indigenous peoples, uh, what is the best way of doing that?
Oh, that's a good question. um, hmm. I think one thing to understand is that, you know, you know, you, I'm spending time in this space right now, right? As myself. I didn't go into too much detail of my history, but there's definitely trauma, right? Intergenerational, and then even within, you know, my own family trauma, which essentially is generational trauma, right? Um, but a lot of it is linked back to these colonial pieces. I think what's important for people to understand is to kind of, if you can, try to come to it with and approach it with um, compassion, kindness, and it's always better to be ignorant, you know, willfully and recognizably ignorant, right? Accepting that, as opposed to being arrogant, right? It's always, and those are within, again, our original instructions of, you know, how we're to relate to one another. And in that, and the reason why I say that is because, you know, I've done a lot of work to get to this point where I can even have these conversations, right? But I'm not everybody. And I also honor, because I work, you know, I work with, you know, the members of my communities that are hurting and are healing, you know, every day, and have been for many, many years, as I mentioned in the presentation, right? I'm very grateful to have, to be able to be part of that journey of those individuals, right? But I can see how sometimes what can happen is, you know, you may be curious, and that's totally fine. That's totally okay. But there needs to be a recognition that everybody's at a different part in their journey. And some people will be able to have these conversations with you, and some people just aren't there, right? Some people are still in survival mode. They're still in their fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Um, and they may not even understand why they have the reactions that they have. So really it's about, again, like I said, coming to the table with compassion and try not to take things too personal, right? And that's how we're all going to strengthen those relationships and have a better understanding, is to be as open as possible and lead from the heart. And even that in itself is an act of rebellion, because Western cultures were mind dominant. They were not heart led. And that's kind of how we got into this mess.
And I know there is a huge explanation about what I'm going to ask you,
Mm-hmm.
but maybe some people are wondering, what are you holding on your dyslexic? So, on your left hand.
Oh, this?
Yes.
Yes, sorry, pardon me. So when I do these talks, like in person, it's a bit different, because in person I would bring my bundle with me, right? And that's that bundle I was talking about in the presentation. It's those tools. It's the core of our identity, of like how we remember how we're rooted, right? Like where we root ourselves. It's basically the way we keep on the path, right? So I have an eagle feather here, and eagles generally mean a lot of different things to a lot of different nations, but essentially the eagle is the messenger between spirit and us. So, and then there's of course layers and layers and layers of teachings around the feather and what that means. And but this is a feather I was given after completing my first fast and starting to walk the path of an Ashkabewis, which is basically a helper, is a ceremonial helper. And this is what I use. I use it in ceremony for different things, but it just helps remind me to come again with kindness, compassion, to walk in that good way, and to try to walk that straight line, right, of purpose. So that's why I held it today. I don't normally hold my eagle feather when I do present, like when I present. Usually I'll hold like maybe some tobacco, or I have some different things that are really significant to me, but I don't really take them out too much. But today I just felt like I needed to. So the eagle's with us today.
Thank you so much, Lindsey.
No problem, miigwech. Now.